So, Tim, why do you think that the study of language is important to philosophy, or is fruitful way of approaching the subject?
Although studying language doesn't necessarily tell you a huge amount about the underlying nature of the world, if you make mistakes about language, you are liable to be led into extremely bad metaphysics, and even, as it were, even if a good philosophy of language can't give you good metaphysics, bad philosophy of language can give you bad metaphysics. And I think people, because of mistakes that they were making in the philosophy of language, which Saul corrected, were arriving at all sorts of conclusions about how they thought that there was some kind of basic logical problem about the ideas that things could have their own essential nature, which was just made them what the thing that they were, and they were ruling out a lot of metaphysical options on the basis of misunderstandings of language. People talk a lot about the linguistic turn in philosophy, and for a long time I think people were treating this as some kind of completely irreversible turn in philosophy, by which somehow philosophy fundamentally had to do with language and words. It's quite understandable why people would think something like that, because one of the sort of central methodological problems for philosophy after the scientific revolution was how much room that the development of natural science left for philosophy to tell us anything about the world. And I think so. One sort of kind of retreat that attracted people was the idea. Well, when we're doing philosophy, we're not really studying how the world is. We're just thinking about either how we do talk about it or what might be a better way of talking about it, and so on, and just as it were clarifying language or something like that. And that was different versions of that idea were very influential. But I think it's becoming clearer that that was really a 20th century idea, which by the end of the 20th century was really actually on the way out. And it doesn't mean that you can do philosophy without paying attention to language, because that's where philosophy is done in language, and we've got to understand how our instruments work in order to use them properly. I mean, if you're an astronomer, you can't say, look, I'm interested in what's going on in space. I'm not interested in telescopes, so I'm not going to spend any time worrying about how my telescope works. I mean, that would be a very naive attitude for an astronomer, and it's a naive attitude for a philosopher to take the same view of language, that we don't need to bother about language, we'll just use it to talk about the world. The role of language in philosophy is more like that than like the idea that somehow there's something very specially linguistic about philosophical questions. When philosophers are interested in time, people tried to interpret that as really that's just an interest in the language that we use to talk about time, or something like that. But I think it's become clear actually that a lot of the interesting philosophical questions are about time itself, and not just about the language that we use about it. But if we misunderstand the language that we use to talk about time, then we're probably going to reason very, very badly about time itself. So we do have to be kind of self-conscious about our use of language, but without, as it were, making that anything like the subject matter of philosophy.
Would you agree with that, Saul?
I suppose I do agree with that, yeah. Of course, time, how we should think about it is a special problem, since Einstein and all that has really changed our conception of which the natural conception is that just there is an objective, right, flow of things are present, past, and so on. And then, of course, the picture has gotten very different. And this is some case where things outside philosophy have affected the philosophical problems. Yeah.
I was going to ask you how important to you is that your views are grounded in common sense
It's very important. Yeah. I always think the common sense view. Well, here I just meant something where maybe physics has undermined what might have been otherwise the natural common sense view. But other than things like that, I think one should preserve G. Moore, who was famous in the 20th century for advocating that the common sense view of the thing should be preserved as much as possible. Such common sense knowledge or something like that is that there is a glass of water in front of me or whatever, or there are tables and chairs and people and so on. Those are more certain than any philosophical theory. And people who think that philosophical theory comes first are wrong, right?
Maybe one thing that's worth saying about this example of time and special relativity, where it seems that in some sense what counts as present depends on what frame of reference you have. I think a lot of people wonder whether there's any room left for philosophy to do anything about a subject like time, because they think shouldn't we just leave that to the physicists? You've got to take account of what the physicists have discovered, and it would not be sensible to try to talk about the nature of time without taking special relativity into account. But the expertise of the physicists does not automatically extend to working out what the implications are for metaphysics, for what this tells us in less formal terms about the nature of the world, and in particular, as it were, just how much of common sense is or isn't undermined by the science. I think that's something that philosophers have their own distinctive skills in thinking about. Not that it's at all easy. A good way of dramatizing a piece of science is by presenting it as having refuted some piece of common sense. And I mean, that's maybe a good way of getting grant money. But it's often, when you look at the science, you see it doesn't have as much of an effect in undermining common sense. It may not leave common sense exactly where it was, but it may not be as disruptive of common sense as that scientists hyping their own discoveries like to pretend.
Right. I entirely agree. Yeah.
An important distinction that you stress in Eminent Necessities between the metaphysical and the epistemological, and you try to separate the notions, and your analysis of names, your work on language led you to that. So
it's hard to say something without telling people to read the book, but a lot of, and of course this is a general audience anyway, but look, I came to conclude that a lot of the confusions that were dominant, say, in the Quinean era that I was talking about, came from confusing two different things. What do we know a priori, that is, in the absence of, anyway, much experimental knowledge or anything, right? Or there's also what we know for certain, which is a different issue, really, because a mathematical calculation may be a priori, but it isn't certain. You may have made a mistake in the calculation. Anyway, those are epistemic notions about knowledge. Okay, but then, according to me, anyway, what I concluded, and Hilary Putnam had, in some respects, some similar views about this, some sorts of statements about necessary properties of particular things, like if this table was made of one substance, the very same table couldn't have been made of another one, right? But that it's made of this substance rather than of that one is not something you necessarily know, but you find out. So people thought that meant it wasn't necessary, but I think that that's confusing and epistemological with what I call a metaphysical notion, or really a notion about what might have been, not what may or may not be, for certain, right? And I wouldn't think any counterfactual situation that doesn't contain this very substance, which is H2O, would contain water, right? Though we don't know without scientific investigation what water consists in, right?